You're standing in a small clearing deep in a forest roughly a million years ago. Someone next to you just froze completely still, eyes locked on something in the undergrowth. No words. There are no words yet, not in any form you'd recognize as language, and yet somehow, within about a second, you understand exactly what they mean. Danger, don't move, look there. A complete urgent life or death message delivered without a single syllable and received perfectly. How does that even work? How do you tell someone something that's specific, that important, using absolutely nothing you'd call a word? This is one of the strangest gaps in the entire story of human evolution, because spoken language, the thing that feels so obviously central to being human that it's hard to imagine functioning without it, is actually a surprisingly late addition to our species' toolkit. Depending on which researchers you ask, and this is genuinely still debated, fully modern spoken language may not have existed in anything like its current form until somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. But our genus Homo has existed for roughly 2.5 million years, which means for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, something like 95% of it by some estimates, our ancestors were coordinating hunts, raising children, forming alliances, warning each other about danger, and building complex social relationships without anything resembling the spoken sentences you're using to understand this video right now. So what were they actually doing instead? And here's the genuinely uncomfortable twist. A huge amount of it you're still doing today right now without even noticing. So let's start with the anatomical evidence, because this is actually one of the more concrete ways researchers have tried to pin down when speech became physically possible at all. Human speech requires an extremely specific vocal tract configuration. A lowered larynx position that creates enough space in the throat to produce the full range of vowel sounds that distinguish spoken language from the more limited call systems other primates use. Researchers studying the base of ancient hominin skulls, looking specifically at a structure called the hyoid bone and the position of certain nerve canals that would have carried the nerves controlling breath and vocal control, have found that this speech-capable anatomy likely wasn't fully in place until relatively recently in our evolutionary timeline, with some evidence suggesting Neanderthals may have had a broadly similar vocal capacity to modern humans. But earlier hominins, like Homo erectus, almost certainly did not have the full physical equipment for anything close to modern speech. Anthropologist Philip Lieberman has spent decades studying exactly this question, reconstructing likely vocal tract shapes from fossil evidence, and his research consistently points to the same conclusion. For most of the genus Homo's existence, the physical hardware for spoken language in the sense you're using it right now simply wasn't there yet. So if you take away spoken words entirely, what's actually left? And the answer turns out to be considerably richer and more sophisticated than the phrase grunting and pointing usually implies in casual conversation about this topic. Let's start with gesture, because there is a genuinely compelling argument, championed by researchers, including primatologist Michael Tomasello, that gesture, not vocal sound, may have been the original foundation of human communication, with spoken language eventually layering on top of an already functional gestural system rather than starting from scratch. The evidence for this comes from an unexpected direction. Chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relatives, use vocal calls that are almost entirely fixed and involuntary, the same alarm call every time regardless of context, essentially impossible to combine into new meanings. But their gestural communication is a completely different story. Researchers studying wild chimpanzee populations have documented dozens of distinct, intentional gestures: arm raises requesting play, specific touches requesting grooming, branch shaking used to initiate travel, and critically, these gestures are used flexibly. They deploy differently depending on the specific social situation and the specific individual being communicated with. Exactly the kind of flexible, intentional signaling that looks like a genuine precursor to language in a way rigid vocal calls simply don't. If our closest relatives already show this kind of sophisticated gestural flexibility, it's a reasonable bet that our shared ancestors did too, and that early hominins built on exactly this gestural foundation for millions of years before vocal language ever entered the picture. Here's where it gets genuinely relevant to your own life, because you are, whether you've ever consciously registered it or not, still running large parts of this ancient gestural system every single day. Researchers studying modern human communication have found that gesture isn't some optional decoration layered on top of speech. It's deeply functionally integrated with it. People who are congenitally blind, who have never once seen another person gesture in their entire lives, still gesture while speaking, at rates strikingly similar to sighted people, even when talking to another blind person who obviously can't see the gesture at all. That's a genuinely strange finding because it suggests gesture isn't purely a learned social performance for the benefit of an observer. It appears to be tied to the actual cognitive process of producing language itself, something closer to a fossil of an older, more physically embodied communication system, still running quietly underneath the spoken words layered on top of it. Now, let's talk about something even older and even stranger than gesture, something that doesn't require any conscious signaling at all: emotional expression through the face and body. Darwin, who we've talked about before on this channel in the context of blushing, wrote an entire separate book specifically on this topic in 1872 called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And his central argument was that certain facial expressions, fear, anger, disgust, happiness, are not learned social conventions that differ arbitrarily by culture the way spoken words obviously do. They're universal, biologically wired signals, recognizable across every human culture ever studied, and recognizable in remarkably similar forms across other primates, too. Modern research, including extensive cross-cultural studies conducted by psychologist Paul Ekman starting in the 1960s, has broadly confirmed this. Show a photograph of someone displaying genuine disgust to a person from a culture with essentially zero prior contact with the culture the photograph came from, and they will, with remarkable consistency, correctly identify the emotion. That kind of universality is a strong signal you're looking at something ancient, predating spoken language by a very wide margin wired into the human nervous system at a level cultural learning simply doesn't reach. This connects directly back to something we've covered on this channel before, too. The fear sweat research, because it turns out ancient humans likely had an entire additional communication channel running in parallel with facial expression and gesture, one that didn't rely on sight at all. Chemical signaling through scent, transmitting information about emotional and physiological state below the level of conscious awareness, meant a message about danger or stress could potentially travel between group members even in low visibility, even in darkness, even when nobody was making eye contact or looking in the right direction to catch a facial expression or a gesture. Stack these three systems together: involuntary facial expression, chemical signaling through the body, and intentional flexible gesture, and you get something that starts to look like a surprisingly sophisticated multi-channel communication network, running for well over 1 million years before a single spoken word entered the picture. There is a fourth piece to this that deserves genuine attention, and it's one that tends to surprise people specifically because it's so easy to underestimate. Vocalization did exist before speech, just not in the form of words. Researchers studying the evolution of music and rhythm, including work associated with musicologist and researcher Stephen Methan, have proposed something genuinely fascinating, sometimes described using the term musa-language, the idea that early hominins likely used pitch, rhythm, and melodic, song-like vocalization to communicate emotional and social information. Well, before those same vocal capabilities were repurposed into the discrete, combinable, meaning carrying sounds that eventually became spoken words. Methan's argument draws on several converging lines of evidence, including the fact that infants across every studied human culture respond to melodic, sing-song speech patterns, sometimes called infant-directed speech or parentes, considerably more strongly than they respond to normal flat speech, long before they have any capacity to understand actual word meanings at all. That pattern suggests something musical and emotionally expressive in vocalization may genuinely be older evolutionarily than something linguistically precise, with actual grammar and vocabulary layering on top of an already existing musical vocal foundation many hundreds of thousands of years later. Think about what all of this actually means when you put it together, because it reframes the entire relationship between speech and everything that came before it. Spoken language didn't arrive to fill some kind of communicative void, replacing a species that had previously been struggling along with nothing at all. It arrived as the final layer on top of an already deeply sophisticated, multi-channel system that had been working and working well for well over 1 million years. Universal, involuntary facial expression communicating emotional state instantly and unfakeably. Chemical signaling through the body operating below conscious awareness entirely. Flexible, intentional gesture capable of conveying specific requests and specific meanings, tailored to specific social situations. Musical, emotionally expressive vocalization, carrying tone and urgency long before it carried discrete words. Spoken language, when it finally did arrive, wasn't inventing communication from nothing. It was adding precision and infinite combinability to a system that was, by every honest measure, already remarkably functional. And here's the genuinely uncomfortable part we're sitting with as we close this out, because it's easy to walk away from all of this thinking it's purely a story about the distant past, something that stopped mattering the moment full spoken language finally clicked into place. It didn't stop mattering. Every one of these ancient systems is still running in you right now, constantly, almost entirely outside your conscious awareness. Your face is broadcasting your emotional state to everyone around you in real time, in ways you can't fully control and often can't even detect in yourself. Your body is still gesturing, even in a phone call where nobody can see you do it. Your voice still carries pitch and rhythm that communicates urgency, warmth, or threat well before anyone consciously processes the actual words you're saying, which is exactly why the same sentence can land as friendly or hostile depending entirely on tone. Spoken language gave humans an extraordinary new tool. It never actually replaced any of the older ones. It just got layered on top, and the older systems, the ones that were quietly keeping small bands of hominins alive for over 1 million years before anyone said a single word, are still doing their job every single time you open your mouth to speak.